I'm Ed Richards. I'm a professor at the LSU Law School. I have been working on climate change and its impact on the Mississippi Delta. My point of view is both that of an environmentalist and an expert in disaster preparation. I would like us to plan a future for the Louisiana coast that both includes the preservation of wetlands and the orderly evacuation of the coast to prevent future massive disasters such as Hurricane Katrina. The headlines about the Louisiana coast focus on the disappearance of the coast. The typical rate that's quoted is a football field an hour. It's not clear that's still the current rate, but it captures the notion of a rapidly disappearing coast. The other thread is that the coast was built up over 7,000 years and has been nearly destroyed by the last 85 years. This is allegedly due to either the Corps of Engineers or efforts by the oil companies to do oil and gas production. And while certainly both of these have an impact on the coast, we're going to talk today about why that impact is probably only transitory when we look at the longer time frame. One of the graphics that you'll see in the national press is one of the Mississippi Delta today and the Mississippi Delta in 2100. Now, these fingers of land that we see down here are actually land that is within Levee Systems. So when Professor Blum and Roberts developed this chart, they assumed there would not be any catastrophic storms between now and 2100 that would breach these levees. If these levees were breached, the Mississippi River and this particular one, and the other branches here of distributaries of the river, would get free, and New Orleans would in fact be an island, and these fingers would be lost. So preserving these is more a political statement than necessarily one that reflects how the land would be looking. Now, Louisiana has formed the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority with the intent of saving the coast. The Coastal Restoration Authority has several classes of projects, but at its core, it wants to build levees. The levees are ultimately the strategy for protecting the coast to hold back hurricanes, which are the major threat to the coast in the short term. The Coastal Restoration Authority also talks about preserving and rebuilding wetlands, and it is this wetland restoration that has caused national environmental groups and local environmental groups to sign on to support the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. As I will argue today, this is probably misguided in that the restoration projects will not be able to succeed, but the levees that will be built will ultimately destroy the wetlands and prevent the orderly retreat of the coast, while ultimately providing no real protection for the cities. I'm going to talk about 4 different cycles today that have very different time frames. The longest term is the movement of the continental plates that created the Gulf of Mexico, as we'll see, and created the natural valley that then filled with the Mississippi River. And in the longer term, this cycle, which is called orogeny, will eventually build mountains here as the mountains in Colorado and the Himalayas are worn down as part of the very long-term geologic cycle. There's a shorter-term cycle, but still one that is in the millions of years, that deals with the deposition of sediment and the subsidence of the Earth's crust that allows the formation of the Mississippi Delta. The next cycle is again a shorter cycle, but one that's thousands of years. And this is the climate cycle, which for our purposes we will see as the sea level cycle. This is driven by the glaciation, which as the climate gets colder, the ice accumulates, it withdraws the water from the ocean. Sea level falls when the ice melts, sea level rises. And finally, superimposed on the sea level cycle, the actual waxing and waning of the delta lobes that's driven by the motion of the river. That's really what moves what we think of colloquially as the delta, the sort of veneer of green and the coast on top of what we'll see is the actual massive delta. Now, man has affected these cycles by building dams on the Mississippi to allow navigation and also to control flooding, levees on the Mississippi, which allows riverside cities, while the folks in southern Louisiana, in particular New Orleans, lament the loss of the delta caused by these dams and levees. There would be no coastal riverside cities without the levees. We have built an old river control structure that prevents the Mississippi from finding a new channel and abandoning New Orleans, and we'll see how that would fit into the natural cycle. All of these things preserve the cities, but they destroy the delta. But again, in the longer view, they have relatively little impact. Key to understanding natural cycles and to using them to think as an environmentalist is to get the time frames right. The tectonic plate cycles you can think of as 100 million year increments. Sediment deposition cycles are million-year increments. Climate is 1,000 years increments. Delta lobes are 100 years. Yet the Coastal Restoration Authority thinks in 10-year cycles, and the politicians who make the decisions about coastal restoration at best think in 4-year increments. I will argue that environmentalists should be looking at least 100 years ahead when we're thinking about sea level rise and climate change. We know that we have started the climate cycle moving. We have hundreds of years of climate change baked in, unless by some miraculous event we stopped all emission of greenhouse gases and were able to magically extract them back from the atmosphere. And so when we're looking into the future for coastal cities, we need to be thinking about 100-year plus times, because that's the time frame that it would really rationally require to decommission a coastal city. I'm going to do a quick geologic history of the Gulf of Mexico and the Mississippi River. Here's our sort of current look at the Gulf of Mexico, which is this area in here. We can see this red line represents basically the Mississippi Valley. This will give us a reference point as we move through time. 220 million years ago, the continents were still joined together, and the Mississippi Valley would enter into just a minor bay. If we do a cross-section along this red line, we would see a small amount of water, but basically there's the mantle and the crust and then the surface topography, the mountains. As we move through time, the continental plates begin to separate. The Gulf of Mexico, as we would recognize it, begins to form, and we begin to see sediment deposited by the river, the Proto-Mississippi River that is forming here. And as we move through time, the continental shelf evolves, sea level rises, pushes in deeply inland during some of these periods. The sediment continues to accumulate. Sea level changes, the continents change. The continents moving themselves dramatically affects sea level, significantly more than the ice cycle does. The sea level rise during the continental drift exceeded 1,000 feet. The sediment continues during this period. So we form and reform, and then the continents begin to look like our modern continents. And we see a very deep sediment bed. Critical thing to understand is that for sediment to accumulate in one place, for a river to, like the Mississippi, to build the delta it builds, the crust of the earth has to be weak, and the crust has to subside and allow the sediment to fill in place. Otherwise, the river would constantly be looking for a new channel as it would clog up with the sediment. This is called building the accommodation space to accommodate the sediment that accumulates. This is why the river, despite all of these long-term changes, has stayed in roughly the same area. It's feeding into a weak spot in the crust, which creates the accommodation space, which allows the river to evolve and develop an ever thicker, more complex mass of sediment. And through time, this just continues to accumulate. We get 5 million years ago. And finally, at the present, we see this along this section, this huge mountain. So rather than the delta being the thin layer of green at the coastal edge, the delta is actually a hundreds of miles long, 60,000 foot thick piece of sediment with complex faulting and geologic structures in it. It moves, it subsides, it has faults that run through it that fragment it. That's why there's oil and gas development here. The faults are where the oil and gas accumulate. This is all possible because the subsidence, the weakness of the crust, allows the sediment to continue to accumulate. Because rivers can't flow uphill, they have to have this constantly subsiding accommodation space. Sea level for the past million years has fluctuated very significantly. We can see as the glacial cycle goes, during the glacial maximas, sea level is 150 meters lower than today. And then at the points what we term the greenhouse Earth, sea level may be 50 meters higher than it is today. And when the sea level, so there are points when there is almost no ice left on Greenland or Antarctica. And there are points where there's 2 miles of ice over Chicago. This causes huge changes in sea level, which have profound effects on river deltas. During the last glacial maxima, where the ice was tied up to 2 miles thick over North America, the sea level dropped by 150 meters. What happened with the Mississippi and the Mississippi Valley is that the coastline recedes out into the ocean, out to the edge of the continental shelf, hundreds of miles from its current location. It creates a massive canyon. As the sea level falls, the coast recedes, the river creates a canyon, and it stays in this canyon as long as sea level stays low. And it builds a small, what we would call a delta, the coast, the intertidal zone, again, where it meets the sea. And if we're looking at a sea level through time chart, basically a glacial cycle chart, we see we're down at this minimum point about 20,000 years ago. When the ice begins to melt, the Mississippi becomes a raging flood, a flood that lasts thousands of years. It carries more sediment than at any other time, massively more sediment than in modern times. Yet despite this massive load of sediment, as we'll see, the coast retreats. What we would call the delta disappears and moves inland. Our real lesson is that sea level rise is what controls the location of the coast, not sediment. So as the sea level rises, as the ice cap melts, we see here was our coast, the glacial maxima, and we come up to the modern coast, pushed inland by this rising sea level. Now there's massive amounts of sediment coming down, and as the sediment comes down, it fills back in this canyon created by the river when the sea level was low. And we can see now that we're almost up to the current period on our sea level chart. Now, if we look at the last few thousand years of sea level rise, we see a dramatic increase in sea level since about 20,000 years ago. But starting about 5,000 years ago, sea level is very constant. Now, sea level is like reading a thermometer. If sea level is constant and the continents are not moving to disrupt sea level, then it also tells us that global temperature is relatively constant. If the temperature rises, ice will melt, water expands, sea level rises. If the temperature falls, water contracts, and ice accumulates, so sea level falls. So during the last 5,000 years, which is also what we would think of as the modern period for civilization, we've had a steady climate. Our climate records are not fine-grained enough to know whether this 5,000-year period of stable climate is an anomaly, but it looks unusual, and the climate has begun to cycle again. Man has triggered this, man will drive it, but one would also expect that once it starts moving, the normal factors that run the climate cycle will exacerbate that cycle. Now, as the river winds around in its channel during this period of rising sea level, it's constrained within this valley. This is our area that was created by our subsidence in the Gulf of Mexico that creates the accommodation space for the river. So the river wanders in this. It looks like a snake. This is a beautiful reconstruction done by Fisk in 1944 of the different paths of the river through time. He shows them in different colors. There are a series of these maps that look like beautiful art, but they show the incredible sinuous nature of the river. Now the question is, why does the river move? And this eventually, we'll see, drives the delta cycle. As the river beds fill with sediment, the river basically clogs up. It's called hydraulic contraction. The river deltas are very flat. You may go inland 30 miles and only rise a foot above sea level. So when the river floods out of its banks, say in a big spring flood, it may cut a new channel and leave that clogged up channel and flow to a different area of the delta, one that has been continuing to subside but has not been filled up to sediment, which will now be lower. The river then abandons its old channel, and that channel will subside. We'll see how that looks in the delta cycle. Key thing to understand is that all the river deltas throughout the world started building about 6,000 years ago when sea level stabilized. So whether we're talking about the Ganges or the Nile or any of the other major river deltas, they all have the same time frame as the Mississippi. There are very different geologies of these deltas, but they have the same age. And as long as sea level is stable, they'll build these large intertidal zones. But as sea level rises or falls, then the coast begins to migrate inland or out towards the continental shelf, depending on the direction of sea level rise. So let's see what this looks like. We're now in our period of stable sea level rise over the last 6,000 years. This is work done by Fraser, published in '67, showing the lobes that form as the river takes these different paths. So we see our first lobe forming here. Then the river moves, changes channels, as we saw on that map of the braided river. And then it changes channels again. And it changes channels again. And it continues this process for 16 lobes. Now, the delta is constantly subsiding. That's what creates the accommodation space to have the delta here. And as the river moves from one lobe to the next lobe, the lobe that it leaves is no longer being fed with sediment, but it's still continuing to subside. So through time, that lobe will sink below sea level. And as these lobes pile up, if we look at a cross section, we can see that, by the color codes, we have old lobes overlain with younger lobes, showing us how the lobes subside away, allowing a new lobe to come in and overlay the old lobe. So we have a constant subsidence with sediment deposited by the river when it's in a particular channel, and when the river moves to a new channel, a new lobe, the sediment is no longer being deposited. Now let's look at this as if we were viewing it from Google Earth. This gives us a better idea about the actual land we'd be seeing. So when these lobes are active, this is the land, the lighter green here. Our coast back up in here is much more stable. It's not subsiding. The river runs through this valley and has the braided river effect, but this is really the trough where the lobes build. And we can see a timeline of history here for each of the deltas. So as we move through time, we form new deltas, but we lose old deltas. And we can see that at no time is this entire complex land. Now we have a historical site, 1,700 years ago. One of the things that's very interesting about the deltas is they evolve in human time rather than the kind of rock time we see on things like the Grand Canyon. 2,500 years ago, we had a huge delta out east and south of New Orleans, in the St. Bernard area. This is the edge of this delta. Now, as this delta is abandoned, we'll see an interesting phenomena here of what happens with the edges. This goes back to a site, archaeological site about 800 years ago, and artifacts from that period. We now see new deltas being formed here. This is now subsiding, receding, and as it recedes, most of this is organic matter, which will break down, but there is some sand, and the heavy sand will accumulate at the edge of the coast. And it forms what looks like a barrier island. But unlike actual barrier islands, which are found off of the mouths of rivers and are constantly fed with sand, this is really a decaying deposit of sand that will gradually be lost. There's nothing to replenish it. And through time, the delta moves back, and we have these sandbars left. At present, this is the Chandelier Islands, which are just the remains of that, just a pile of sand from the remains of that old coastal lobe. And they are going below sea level as the sea subsides. This was one that was above sea level but is now sunk below sea level, and so it becomes a shoal. And our delta has receded. But in 1932, we have finished leveeing the river, so the river can't really easily change course very well. And we come to the present, the river is trapped, but it's hydraulically contracting, which means it's delivering less and less sediment. And we've now built a structure up in this area called the Old River Control Structure, which prevents the Atchafalaya River, which would be coming down this way, from capturing the flow of the Mississippi. The Mississippi would prefer now to go through a channel on this side of the delta, and it might even build a small new lobe here, as we see with this bit of the Atchafalaya and the small Atchafalaya Delta. But had the river been allowed to do that, it would slow its flow and eventually stop flowing past New Orleans. It would be impossible to do navigation effectively, and there would not be enough fresh water in the river for drinking or industrial use. So the river was constrained, which means that it will gradually clog up and fill with sand on this expanse. The sand now is mostly not getting to the lower river. It's in this clogged channel, but it can't go down and really build land here. And we can see the loss of land starting in 1932. This is an area, Port Fourchon, and it's important because this is the major area where offshore oil and gas comes into the United States. This is Grand Isle. We look at a magnified view, and the map is from 1932. 1932 is a demarcation point, but the main reason it is this point is this is when we've had the first aerial photography. It's very difficult to make an accurate map of wetlands with regular surveying techniques. It wasn't until there was aerial photography and then satellites we had accurate maps. So we have very good records of loss of wetlands since 32, and that tends to lead to an assumption that that's when the loss started. As you can see, between 1932 and 2010, we've seen a massive loss of these wetlands. Grand Isle, the road that goes down to Grand Isle, is flooded on high tides and completely flooded on storms, and they're gradually taking this entire road and elevating it into a causeway, because in a few more years, Grand Isle will not just be an isle, it'll be an isle that will be tens of miles off of the Louisiana coast. Grand Isle itself is only still in place because we constantly pump sand to elevate it. So if we look at coastal land area change since 1932, it's estimated there's been about 1,800 square miles of land lost. The average rate is about 20 square miles a year. Now, a question, of course, is this when the land loss started? Is this the belief that it's only the last 85 years where we've lost the delta? So since 1932, we've lost about 1,900 square miles. Yet, if we go back and look at all of those delta lobe maps, and we look at where the land was and then where the land is gone, we saw there was a delta all the way out here. This area is now 20, 30 feet below sea level. This edge, this barrier island, is now below water as a shoal. There are cypress stumps buried in the mud 20 feet below sea level from the subsidence over the last 1,000 years. This is the Chandelier Islands, which was well inside of the delta lobe. So through time, we've seen maybe 10,000 square miles of land that has been formed and then lost as the river moves to a new lobe and the old lobe subsides. Now, if we divide this into subsidence zones, we see that we talked about this area is very stable. This first zone subsides less, and subsidence becomes higher as you get to the edge, and we see quite fast subsidence at this edge, both the deep level subsidence, but also from this organic material that builds the delta. As soon as the plants go below sea level and die, the organic material breaks up, becomes food for fish and microorganisms, and the soil just disappears. Since it's not mineral soil predominantly, it's just predominantly wetlands. We can see a magnified area, and the red here are subsidence hotspots on what's termed the Bird's Foot Delta down at the end of the Mississippi River. And we can see that since there's no more sediment feeding this, both because sediment isn't coming down the river and because the levee prevents it from getting outside into the wetlands, these are rapidly disappearing. So when we look back at the claim that the delta has disappeared over the last 85 years and everything was fine before then, first, we don't really know what it looked like until we had aerial maps in 1932, but we also know that the sediment in the river reached a modern high point in 1932. Nothing like it was in the glacial melting high points, but the sediment increased in the 1800s when the sod busters plowed the prairie and broke up the grass, and then bad farming techniques caused huge amount of loss and led to the Dust Bowl. But since then, we've used better farming techniques, we've built dams, we've built levees, and that keeps sediment out of the river. The hydraulic contraction is preventing the sediment that is coming down the river, particularly the sand that's really critical for building delta, from making it all the way to the mouth of the river. It's really not lost into the Gulf of Mexico. It's trapped between the old river control structure and Baton Rouge. But the most important change is sea level rise. So let's look at subsidence and then sea level rise to look at relative sea level rise. This is a map of subsidence values measured by modern techniques using highly precise GPS stations. And we see subsidence levels of 4, 5, 6 millimeters a year. If we go down and we look at the current parishes, Orleans Parish, where New Orleans is, 54% is already below sea level. That's mostly because when you build a levee and you pump the water from behind the levee, the top 40 or 50 feet of organic matter dry out. As they dry, they break down to methane and carbon dioxide. The same effect we're concerned about with the tundra as it thaws. So it contributes to greenhouse gases, and it loses physical volume. So there are parts of New Orleans that are 15 feet below sea level, and they've gotten there over the past 100 years due to pumping the water out behind the levees. Now, there are talks of maybe that they shouldn't pump water and try to live with nature, but the reality is if you're 15 feet below sea level, you have a constant influx of water and you're surrounded by a levee. If you don't continually pump, the city will just fill up with water. Now, assuming no increase in sea level, just subsidence is going to put 85% of New Orleans below sea level by 2100. And we can see the same effect for the other coastal parishes. So in the absence of any significant changes in sea level, subsidence alone will pull them below sea level. Now, when we look at the projections of sea level rise, in the IPCC, we see their relatively conservative estimate of 0.4, and their sort of extreme was 0.8 with a distribution of maybe up to 1 meter. But this extreme range assumes that we would stop and stabilize greenhouse gases at levels that we've already reached. So pretty much everyone expects that this will continue to be revised upward because we are making no progress on greenhouse gas reduction, and there's little hope for any progress in the future. So we'll continue to see this increase. So if we go down to Grand Isle and look at tidal gauges, we'll see that in Grand Isle over the last, since the 1920s, we've had 0.5 meter of sea level rise. Well, that represents only about a fairly small amount of actual sea level rise. The rest is subsidence. If we look at Pensacola, Florida as a reference point, Pensacola is on stable ground. It's not subsiding. So if we subtract Pensacola from Grand Isle, which controls for actual sea level rise, we see a 300 millimeter difference since 1920, and that represents the subsidence that we're seeing at Grand Isle. So we've had, since 1932, we've had 20 inches of combined subsidence and sea level rise, relative sea level rise on Grand Isle, roughly 0.5 meter. That is a rate that is sufficient to move the coast, to destroy hundreds of square miles of wetlands, when you think that you may have a rise of 1 foot or less in 30 miles inland. So 1.5 feet of relative sea level rise could destroy wetlands back 20 or 30 miles from the old coast. If there was no sea level rise, it would be technically possible to stabilize parts of the delta by taking out all the dams and the levees. However, without dams and levees, there'd be no riverside cities, and there'd be no navigation, and thus all the reasons that people want to have the Mississippi River would disappear. New Orleans, southern Louisiana, is left with the dilemma that if we were to try to stabilize the delta, that the resulting river floods would make it impossible for them to live where they live. But as we've seen in every previous climate cycle, it's sea level rise, not sediment, that determines where the coast is. So it's going to rapidly retreat inland no matter what we do on the edge. This chart was built basically assuming a 1 meter subsidence plus sea level rise, which is a fairly conservative estimate. We can kind of see into the future when we have a hurricane. Here's the 2100 chart again, and this shows the flooding that came from the surge from Hurricane Ike, which came aground in Houston, didn't even come near the Louisiana coast, yet the surge it drove basically flooded Louisiana in a way that looks remarkably like 2100. So in a sense, our smaller hurricanes give us a sense about what 2100 looks like. Perhaps our larger hurricanes give us a sense about what 2150 would look like. What we really need to take away from learning about the delta cycles is that the common notion of the Mississippi Delta is really just this thin veneer of wetlands on top of this 60,000 plus foot thick mountain. The location of that thin veneer moves inland and out into the ocean, driven by sea level, not driven by sediment. While the loss of the sediment from the levees and dams caused some additional loss of wetlands on this coastal zone, that's a transitory phenomena that will be rapidly swamped by sea level rise. This natural process can't be reversed. The sea level will push the coast inland, whatever we try to do with it. All of the current coastal restoration efforts are a combination of building levees and then piling stuff up on the edges. There are various strategies for piling stuff up on the edges, diverting the river to try to pile up sediment in the river, using giant dredges to pump sediment up into the subsiding areas. Whatever strategy is used, the long-term effect can't affect relative sea level rise. So if we think of today, here's the sea level running through this. The natural levee is just the high point on the sides of the river, and we can see we have people living here, and they have a hurricane protection levee, and there's a marsh growing here. Now let's move 75 years into the future, and let's assume that we've piled stuff up on the edge, we've built this marsh up. Sea level continues to rise. We're going to have to continue to raise this levee, and everything that is behind this levee continues to go below sea level. Now, the critical point is that the areas of the coast that are not yet leveed, the ones that would be drowned in the 2100 map, will be drowned unless they're leveed. The Coastal Restoration Plan wants to build levees to protect all of them, and its theory is that it will then be able to build wetlands in front of the levees, and that thus will preserve the wetlands and have levees, as everything below the levees goes farther and farther below sea level. Well, you can imagine as sea level rises by another couple of meters, how ridiculous this situation will be. Now, all of the good science illustrates that these marshes, once they're backed up against these levees, are not going to be able to continue to grow effectively, and they will eventually be drowned. If you want to look ahead and see what this will look like, look at Holland, where they have built levees on their coast, and they've basically decided they didn't care about the wetlands. Their survival of the country was more important. That's where we will be. As an environmentalist, looking 100 years ahead, we can see we probably have at least a meter of sea level rise, certainly a meter of relative sea level rise baked in, very likely a meter and a half or more. But over the next 200 or 300 years, we know there are 2 to 3 to 4 more meters of sea level rise that we will see. That's already going to happen based on greenhouse gases currently in the atmosphere. Over the next 100 years, the coast of Louisiana will move inland. If there are levees in the way, as the coast backs up to the levees, the wetlands will be drowned, will end up looking like Holland. There will be no coastal wetlands. At the same time, the levees will prove inadequate to protect against the hurricanes that are now on top of a meter to a meter and a half higher sea level. So ultimately, it's not a choice between people and nature. It is a choice to allow the coast to retreat naturally, with the people retreating inland and the wetlands retreating inland. Because over the next 100 to 200 years, it will be untenable to live in coastal cities such as New Orleans, where they are in very flat plains with no elevation, unlike cities such as New York City. And what we really need to think about is, how do we get to 2100 and then 2200, preserving as much of the natural environment and limiting as much of the disasters such as Hurricane Katrina as possible. Thanks, and you can feel free to get in touch with me.